In the spring of 1915, a country that had spent 30 years as an ally of Germany and Austria-Hungary did something almost no one saw coming. It turned around, tore up its old alliance, and marched to war against the very powers it had promised to fight beside. This is the story of how Italy stumbled into the First World War, and how a decision made in secret behind closed doors, without the knowledge of its own parliament, sent hundreds of thousands of young men into mountains and river valleys where they would be slaughtered by the tens of thousands within weeks. By the time you finish this video, you'll understand why some historians call Italy's entry into the war one of the strangest betrayals in modern history, and why the soldiers who fought and died on the Isonzo front barely even understood what they were fighting for. When the guns of August erupted across Europe in 1914, Italy was technically obligated to join the fight. For decades, Rome had been bound to Berlin and Vienna in what was called the Triple Alliance, a defensive pact meant to protect all three nations if they were attacked. But when Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia and dragged the continent into chaos, Italy's leaders noticed something important. Austria-Hungary hadn't been attacked. Austria-Hungary had started the war, and that one technicality gave Italy the excuse it needed to do nothing at all. The Italian government declared neutrality, stepping back from the alliance it had belonged to for over 3 decades, and for a moment, it looked like Italy might sit out the greatest war the world had ever seen. But neutrality was never going to last, and here's why. Italy wasn't just sitting on the sidelines out of caution. It was watching, calculating, and negotiating with both sides at once, trying to figure out which side would pay more for its loyalty. This is where the story gets almost unbelievable. While publicly claiming neutrality, the Italian government was secretly holding talks with both the Central Powers and the Allied powers, essentially running an auction for its own army. Whoever offered the better deal in territory would win Italy's support. It sounds more like a business negotiation than a matter of national honor, and that's exactly what it was. Italy's foreign minister at the time summed up the country's true feelings in a private letter that revealed just how cynical the calculations had become. He wrote that the ideal outcome for Italy would be if both Austria and France ended up defeated and exhausted, leaving Italy free to pick up the pieces. Let that sink in for a moment. The nation wasn't hoping for a righteous victory. It was hoping everyone else would destroy each other so Italy could walk away with the spoils. This wasn't patriotism, this was pure cold opportunism, and it was about to cost hundreds of thousands of lives. While the politicians schemed in private, the Italian public was tearing itself apart in a much louder, much more dangerous debate. On one side stood the neutralists, a coalition that included socialists, the Catholic Church, rural farmers, and most of Parliament. They wanted nothing to do with a war that promised only bloodshed and destruction. On the other side stood the interventionists, a smaller but far louder group of nationalists, industrialists, and firebrand political figures who believed war was Italy's destiny, a chance to finish the unification of the nation and seize territory that rightfully belonged to Italians. Among these war hawks was a man history would remember for very different reasons. A young socialist journalist named Benito Mussolini broke from his own party to support the war, arguing that conflict was necessary to prevent revolution and save the monarchy. His own party expelled him for it. Little did anyone know this expulsion would set him on a path toward becoming one of the 20th century's most infamous dictators. Meanwhile, a flamboyant poet and war enthusiast named Gabriele D'Annunzio returned from exile in France to deliver electrifying speeches that whipped crowds into a nationalist frenzy, calling for blood, glory, and the destruction of Italy's own peaceful political system. These men weren't fighting for defense, they were fighting for spectacle, for national mythology, for a war they imagined would be short, glorious, and transformative. And here's the twist that makes this story even more tragic. The majority of ordinary Italians and the majority of Parliament did not want this war, but the loud minority controlled the streets, the newspapers, and eventually the government's decisions. Sound familiar? A small group of the most aggressive voices drowning out a quiet, exhausted majority. This wasn't democracy in action. This was democracy being hijacked by those willing to shout the loudest. While the public argued in the streets, the real decision had already been made behind their backs. In April of 1915, Italy secretly signed the Treaty of London with Britain, France, and Russia, agreeing to join the Allied war effort within 1 month. In exchange, Italy was promised massive territorial rewards, land along the Austrian border, islands in the Adriatic colonial influence in Africa, and a share of the post-war spoils. The treaty was signed in total secrecy. The Italian public had no idea their government had already committed the nation to war. Parliament, the very body meant to represent the will of the people, hadn't been consulted either. When the news eventually broke, it triggered a government crisis so severe that the Prime Minister offered his resignation. believing he couldn't hold the fractured nation together, but the king refused to accept it. Parliament reluctantly caved to public and royal pressure, and on May 23, 1915, Italy formally declared war on its former ally, Austria-Hungary. Now here's where things get even darker, because what followed wasn't the quick, glorious war that Italian nationalists had promised the public. It was a nightmare, and it started almost immediately. The front line that Italy now had to defend stretched an almost unimaginable 650 kilometers, mostly through the Alps, a landscape more brutal and unforgiving than almost any other battlefield of the entire war. These weren't gentle rolling hills. These were jagged peaks rising nearly 4,000 meters into the sky, icy ridgelines where soldiers would have to fight not just each other but frostbite, avalanches, and altitude itself. And Italy, despite months of preparation time, was nowhere near ready for what was coming. The Italian army had roughly 1 million men under arms, but that number hides a devastating reality. Conscription hadn't been completed. Countless able-bodied men had emigrated to the Americas in the years before the war, leaving gaps in the ranks that couldn't be filled quickly. There weren't enough trained officers. There weren't enough machine guns. There weren't enough of the heavy artillery pieces that modern warfare had already proven were essential for breaking through fortified positions. The army was still recovering from a costly colonial war fought in Libya just a few years earlier, and now it was being thrown into a fight against an enemy that had spent months preparing defensive positions in some of the most naturally fortified terrain in Europe. And that enemy, the Austro-Hungarians, knew exactly what was coming. Despite suffering catastrophic losses on their Russian and Balkan fronts, they managed to scrape together defenders for this new southwestern front, pulling in regular troops alongside local militias, some manned by men in their 70s. It sounds desperate, and it was, but it worked, because the terrain did most of the fighting for them. Austrian positions sat perched on mountains and ridgelines overlooking every possible route the Italians could take. Engineers had reinforced these positions with concrete bunkers and multiple belts of barbed wire, some stretching 9 meters thick. On top of that, Austro-Hungarian intelligence had a shocking advantage, receiving detailed information about Italian troop movements from a neutral Swiss intelligence contact, meaning the defenders often knew where the attackers were heading before the attack even began. If you think that sounds like a losing situation for Italy, you're right. But Italian commander Luigi Cadorna had a plan built entirely around one factor: overwhelming numbers. He believed that with enough men and enough artillery, sheer force could crush any defensive position, no matter how well fortified. It was the kind of plan that looks decent on paper and turns into a meat grinder in reality. And that meat grinder had a name that would become synonymous with senseless slaughter for the rest of the war: the Isonzo River. The first major Italian offensive of the war began in June of 1915. Along this river and the barren, rocky plateau surrounding it, nearly 500,000 Italian soldiers, backed by 1,800 artillery pieces, faced off against roughly half as many Austro-Hungarian defenders. On paper, this should have been an easy Italian victory. In reality, it became an early warning of the horror to come. The Italian bombardment before the attack was weak, limited by shortages of ammunition and heavy guns, which meant the enemy defenses were barely scratched before Italian infantry had to walk directly into them. Soldiers charged uphill into machine gun fire and barbed wire they often couldn't even cut through in time. Rain turned the ground to mud in some sectors, while rocky terrain in others made it impossible to dig any kind of protective trench, leaving attacking soldiers completely exposed. One Italian officer, describing a disastrous uphill assault on a heavily defended mountain position, wrote about watching an entire style of romantic old-fashioned warfare get annihilated within moments, crushed by modern weapons that showed no mercy for old ideas about glory and heroism. This wasn't the war Italy's poets and nationalists had promised. This was industrial slaughter, and it was only the beginning. When the offensive finally ground to a halt in early July, the numbers told a brutal story. Italian forces had advanced only a few hundred meters, at the cost of roughly 15,000 casualties. The Austro-Hungarians, despite holding their ground successfully, still suffered around 10,000 casualties of their own defending it. Neither side had won anything meaningful, but Italy had learned an expensive lesson about the difference between having more soldiers and actually being able to use them effectively. But here's the part that should genuinely disturb you. Instead of stepping back to rethink strategy, Cadorna launched a second offensive just 10 days later, throwing troops right back into the same grinding machine that had already failed once. If you're starting to feel like this war was less about strategy and more about pure, stubborn repetition of the same mistake, you're exactly right, and it only gets worse from here. The Second Battle of the Isonzo began in mid-July with better preparation and heavier artillery than the first attempt, but the results were painfully similar. Italian troops managed to fight their way into the outskirts of a key town, engaging in brutal house-to-house combat, only to be pushed back out again. One heavily contested mountain changed hands 3 separate times, captured by Italian forces and then retaken by Austro-Hungarian counterattacks. Over and over in a horrifying cycle that gained neither side any real advantage. On the rocky plateau nearby, the fighting became even more gruesome because every artillery shell that struck the hard stone ground sent deadly splinters of rock flying through the air alongside shrapnel, turning the very ground itself into a weapon against the men fighting on it. An Austro-Hungarian soldier caught in the bombardment described artillery fire so intense it felt like more than any human being could endure. Noting that the number of wounded had become so overwhelming, there weren't enough stretcher bearers left to carry them all away. Another soldier, writing in his diary during the height of the shelling, described watching bodies and pieces of bodies scattered everywhere around him in circles, convinced he was about to die. That diary entry stopped mid-sentence. The soldier writing it was killed before he could finish his thought. Sit with that for a second. A young man's final words, cut off forever, mid-sentence, because an artillery shell ended his life before he could complete the thought. When the Second Battle of the Isonzo finally ended in early August, the casualty numbers were even worse than the first. Italy suffered roughly 42,000 men killed or wounded. The Austro-Hungarians suffered even more, around 46,000 casualties, largely because of relentless Italian shelling and the cost of repeated counterattacks needed to hold their positions. 2 massive offensives, tens of thousands dead and wounded, and the front line had barely moved at all. If you're wondering how morale held up under conditions like this, the honest answer is that it didn't. And this is where the human tragedy of Italy's entry into the war becomes almost unbearable to think about. Most of the soldiers fighting and dying in these mountains weren't fired-up nationalists who believed in reclaiming ancestral Italian land. They were peasants, farmers, laborers, many of whom had barely any connection to the grand nationalist dream that politicians and poets back home had used to justify the war. Italy's unification as a single nation had only happened 50 years earlier, and for countless soldiers from rural villages, the idea of a unified Italian identity worth dying for still felt distant and abstract. One soldier later admitted that he genuinely didn't know why the war was even happening, explaining that commanders never bothered explaining anything to the ordinary troops, leaving each man to invent his own reasons for staying alive in the mud and the gunfire. Faced with impossible attacks, incompetent leadership, brutal conditions, and no clear understanding of what they were even fighting for, soldiers began to break. Roughly 9,000 Italian troops deserted in 1915 alone, and by the war's end, the Italian military would execute around 4,000 of its own men for desertion, cowardice, or insubordination, among the harshest disciplinary records of any army in the entire war. Commander Cadorna believed brutal discipline was the answer to failing morale. In reality, it only deepened the resentment and despair spreading through the ranks. By the time the summer of 1915 came to an end, Italy had entered the war expecting a short, triumphant campaign that would fulfill decades of nationalist dreams and secure new territory at minimal cost. Instead, 2 massive offensives had failed to achieve any meaningful breakthrough. Tens of thousands of men were dead or wounded, and the Italian army was already showing dangerous cracks in discipline and morale. Cadorna responded by firing 27 generals, but replacing leadership couldn't fix the deeper problems: poor tactics, inadequate equipment, and an army that had been thrown into one of the most difficult combat environments in Europe without the preparation needed to survive it. And here's the part that makes this story truly haunting if you know where it eventually leads. This was only 1915. Italy would go on to fight nearly a dozen more battles along this same river, the same brutal cycle of attack, failure, and mounting casualties for 2 more years, before suffering one of the most catastrophic military collapses of the entire war at a place called Caporetto in 1917, a defeat so total it nearly knocked Italy out of the conflict entirely. Everything you just heard, the secret treaty, the divided nation, the reckless offensives, the staggering losses, wasn't the tragedy. It was only the opening chapter of a much longer, much darker story. Italy entered the First World War, not out of necessity, not because it was attacked, not even because its own people demanded it, but because a small circle of politicians made a secret calculation about territory and power, while a loud minority of nationalists drowned out a quiet, war-weary majority. The result was a nation stumbling into a conflict it wasn't prepared for, fighting on terrain that punished every mistake, led by commanders who repeated the same failed strategy again and again, while ordinary soldiers, many of whom barely understood why they were there, paid the price in blood month after month, mountain after mountain, river crossing after river crossing. That's the true story of how Italy stumbled into World War I. A war built on secret promises, national ego, and a devastating miscalculation about what modern warfare would actually cost. If this story of miscalculation, betrayal, and tragedy on an unimaginable scale caught your attention, there's an entire hidden history of the First World War still waiting to be uncovered. Forgotten battles, forgotten soldiers, and forgotten decisions that shaped the world we live in today.